Picture the galaxy. Year 60 of the quarantine, a map stretching from the mythic Concord in the galactic north, down through the silt worlds, past the trade gates of Olovar, and out into the long, quiet dark beyond the Perseus Shelf. Now trace your finger along the shipping lanes from Tessinar Prime to the foundry rings of Kel, from the diplomatic spires of UN to the agricultural moons of Brasktar. These were the arteries of the Galactic Council. Grain, ore, data, and treaty paper flowed through them by the convoy. And for 6 decades, one small region of those arteries was sealed off, marked on every chart with the same 3-letter code, QNT quarantine. Now zoom into Tessinar Prime, a hollow moon carved into a planetary library where 41 species send their archivists to file the decisions of the Council. 10,000 reading rooms, 3 million sealed cabinets. A staff of 12,000 keepers who spend their long lives indexing the slow paperwork of civilization. I'm one of them. My name is Keeper Olimvreth. I have served in the Hall of Sealed Decisions for 412 years, and on my desk this morning is a file I'm required by law to read aloud before the Council reopens it. The file is labeled Earth. The Council had ships, tens of thousands of them, cruisers the length of small cities, diplomatic vessels that could broker a peace treaty between two species who had never met, surveillance platforms so subtle they could count the heartbeats of a sleeping continent. And yet, for 60 years, none of them could answer one simple question: was the species inside the quarantine still alive? Because the quarantine was not built to be a weapon, it was built to be a silence. And the species inside it, it turned out, had never learned to listen. And here's the part that no junior archivist has been told. The Council did not lose Earth to a war. It did not lose Earth to a counterattack, or a fleet, or a betrayal. The Council lost Earth because 41 species, in 41 languages, voted to erase a civilization by ignoring it, and the civilization in question simply did not notice it was being ignored. This is the story of how a sealed file changed the course of the galaxy. To understand why the Earth file mattered, you have to understand what the Council looked like in the years before the vote. And the short version is this: it was bored. The last Great War had ended 180 years earlier. The mythic Concord had subdued the final independent system in the trailing arm, and the long peace had begun. For nearly 2 centuries, delegate chambers across the galaxy had been filled with the slow business of running a stable civilization. Trade tariffs, inheritance disputes, the rotation of agricultural quotas. Species like the Bzl HFY, my own people, thrived in this environment. Species like the mythic Concord, who had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of administrative empire, considered it their golden age. Then a slow light beacon from the Sol system pinged a Council relay buoy at the edge of charted space. And overnight, the delegate chambers were no longer bored. The beacon was not a greeting, it was leakage. Stray electromagnetic radiation from a young, loud, unshielded species that had no idea anyone was listening. The intercept team on Tessinar Prime listened for 11 days and produced a preliminary report. The report described a planet with 36 active nation states, 200 languages broadcasting simultaneously, a chemical industry advanced enough to be alarming, and a habit of pointing nuclear weapons at itself for entertainment. Delegate Wirren Ka of the Silt Worlds read the report and laughed. He told the assembly that this species would either kill itself within a century or join the Council within 2. The mythic Concord did not laugh. The High Arbiter Solowan, who had read every previous First Contact report in the Council archive, read this one and asked a different question. He asked whether the Council had ever encountered a species this loud, this fast, and this fractured, and survived the encounter. The archive said no. The archive said every prior contact with a fractured species had ended in either annexation or atrocity. And so Solowan began to draft a third option. By Council year 11,847, the Earth file was the largest active dossier on Tessinar Prime. It contained 9,000 pages of intercepted broadcasts, 300 hours of decoded video, and a single recommendation written in Solowan's own hand. Do not contact this species, do not annex this species, seal the system behind a soft barrier, dampen its outbound signals, and wait for it to collapse. The Council had a fleet, a vast one, battle cruisers, diplomatic envoys, and the great surveillance platforms of the Olovar shipyards. On paper, going to Earth and simply telling humanity that the galaxy existed should have taken 6 months and resolved itself peacefully. Most species had welcomed the news. The Brastar had cried. The Olivarans had thrown a festival that lasted a generation. Even the proud mythic Concord, when they were contacted 9,000 years earlier, had bowed gracefully and asked where to sign. The council understood first contact. The council had done it 40 times, and the council was terrified of doing it a 41st time, because the warships and the diplomatic envoys and the surveillance platforms were all built for one thing: speaking to a species that wanted to be spoken to. They were not built for a species that broadcast its own funeral songs at full volume into the dark and had never once asked who was listening. A council envoy ship was magnificent at opening conversations. It was useless at closing one that had never started. So Soluan proposed something the council had only attempted twice before in its recorded history, and both times on species too primitive to understand they had been touched. A full quarantine, no contact, no signal, no acknowledgement. Let the species exhaust itself in isolation, the way every fractured species in the archive had eventually done. In 20 years, perhaps 30, the file could be closed. The galaxy could move on. The vote was held in the Grand Chamber on Tessinar Prime. 41 species, 40 signatures. One dissent from Delegate Warun Ka of the Silt Worlds, who said for the record that he did not believe humanity would behave the way the archive predicted. He was overruled, the seal was applied, and the Earth file was carried by an archivist, whose name I will not give because it was my own, down into the lower vaults of the Hall of Sealed Decisions. That was 60 years ago. The word quarantine gets used loosely in council debate, so let us break it down. A council quarantine, in the technical sense, is a three-layered exclusion field. The first layer is the Oort barrier, a lattice of slow orbit dampeners placed in the outermost reaches of a target system. It does not block ships, it blocks signals. Any electromagnetic broadcast attempting to leave the system is absorbed, decohered, and scattered into background noise. Any signal attempting to enter is similarly degraded. The barrier is invisible from inside. From outside, the target system appears as a faint silent zone on the galactic map. The second layer is the diplomatic blackout. Every council species is forbidden by treaty from acknowledging the quarantine system's existence. No trade, no envoys, no mention in official correspondence. Younger species do not even learn the quarantine system's name. The quarantine is, in essence, a coordinated act of forgetting. The third layer is the verification protocol. Once every 5 years, a council probe is dispatched to the edge of the barrier to confirm that the quarantined species is still inside, still alive, and still behaving as predicted. The probe is not meant to be seen. It collects passive data, returns, and files its findings with Tessinar Prime. Compare this to a council war fleet. A war fleet costs the equivalent of an entire planet's annual output. It requires the cooperation of 24 species. It kills uncountable numbers of people on both sides. It leaves a wound in the galactic record that takes 1,000 years to scar over. On paper, the quarantine wins every comparison. It is cheaper, it is quieter, it is. The Mythic Concord argued, more humane. The target species does not even know it is being acted upon. It simply continues its existence in a slightly smaller bubble, and over time that bubble closes in on it. But here's what the quarantine assumed that the war fleet did not. First, it assumed the target species knew the galaxy existed. A quarantine works by denying access to something. If the species has not yet realized there is anything to be denied, the denial does nothing. Second, it assumed the target species depended on outside contact for technological progress. Every previous quarantine had been applied to species already engaged in interstellar trade. Cut them off and they regressed. Humanity had never traded a single gram of anything with anyone. Third, it assumed the target species was psychologically wired to notice silence. Most council species, when isolated, grow anxious within a generation. The silence presses on them. They seek connection. Humanity, the archive would later reveal, had spent its entire evolutionary history shouting into a sky that never answered, and had long ago made peace with the lack of reply. Fourth, and most embarrassing, it assumed the verification protocol would actually work. And the irony, my colleagues, is that the archive should have told us. The archive contained the original intercept reports. The reports described the species that broadcast in 300 languages simultaneously and listened in none of them. The reports described a civilization that had sent metal objects out of its own gravity well purely to see if it could. The reports described a 1,000-year history of humans isolating themselves on purpose in deserts and on mountains and on small islands in the middle of vast oceans, and emerging not weaker but stranger and more capable. The Brasktar archivists had even flagged a phrase that appeared in 17 separate human languages, a phrase that translated roughly as "nobody is coming to save us, so we will save ourselves." The phrase appeared in their religious texts, their political speeches, their popular songs, and their children's stories. It was, in retrospect, a warning printed on the side of the box. The council read these reports and decided that they described a fragile species. The council was wrong. Humanity was not a species that needed the galaxy. Humanity was a species that had built itself in the assumption that there was no galaxy and had thrived in that assumption for 10,000 years. The quarantine did not change anything for them. It simply matched a condition they had already accepted as the basic shape of reality. The Oort barrier was to humanity indistinguishable from the universe behaving normally. It was, in the truest sense, the perfect weapon applied to the only species in the galaxy that could not be wounded by it. By Council Year 11,859, 12 years into the quarantine, High Arbiter Soluan convened a private session of the Mythic Concord. He had read the first two verification probe reports, and they troubled him. The first probe had been launched in Year 5. It was a long, slim, silent vessel designed to drift past the Oort barrier on a passive trajectory, photograph the Earth from a safe distance, and return. It did not return. The Council assumed it had been destroyed by a micrometeorite. The strategy was to wait, build a second probe, and try again. The second probe was launched in Year 10. It was identical to the first. It also did not return. But this time, a Brasktar long-range scanner caught a faint signature near the inner rim of the Sol system. The signature did not match a destroyed probe. It matched a functional probe with its identification beacon stripped, being towed in slow loops around what the Council later identified as a Martian shipyard. The report was filed under inconclusive. Soluan called the emergency session. He asked, plainly, how a quarantined species with no knowledge of the galaxy had acquired a Council probe and incorporated it into a shipyard. The Mythic Concord delegates had no answer. Delegate Warinka of the Silt Worlds, attending as a courtesy, suggested with what I will charitably describe as restrained amusement that perhaps the species had simply found the probe and decided it was interesting. The session voted to escalate. The next probe would not be passive. It would carry active surveillance. It would be smaller, faster, and harder to capture. And it would be operated by a live archivist in shifts from a relay station 6 light years out. The archivist they chose for the first shift was me. I sat in that relay station for 11 months. I watched the third probe enter the Sol system in Year 18. I watched it photograph a green and blue world, brighter than the file had suggested it would be by then. I watched it identify 317 artificial structures in orbit, where the file had predicted by Year 18, perhaps 11. I watched a human spacecraft of a design we did not recognize approach our probe at a leisurely pace, attach a magnetic clamp, and tow it into a low orbit around a moon I had never seen mapped before. The moon was not the Earth's moon. It was a smaller body in a different orbit, which I later realized had been constructed. The probe transmitted for another 4 minutes before its signal was cut. The final image it sent was of a human in a pressure suit, waving directly into the camera before reaching forward, and I believe switching it off out of courtesy. I filed the report myself. I filed it under... I was not yet ready to write the word that the report required, which was the word that the entire Council had been avoiding for a decade. The word was thriving. There were 5 major verification attempts in the years that followed, and each one taught the Council something it did not want to learn. I will recount them in the order they occurred, because the order matters. The first was the Costa incident in Year 23. The Council, frustrated by the loss of 3 probes, attempted a different approach. A small automated mining drone was disguised as a captured asteroid and inserted into the outer belt of the Sol system. The plan was to let it drift, sample the local environment, and report back over a period of years. It functioned for 9 months. Then it was discovered in the course of routine asteroid harvesting operations by a Brazilian orbital engineer named Mariana Costa. Costa was the lead foundry technician at a privately funded asteroid processing facility, which the Council had not known existed. The facility itself was not a problem. Humanity, by Year 23, had built 68 such facilities. The problem was Costa's response to finding our drone. According to intercepted internal communications, she examined the device for approximately 3 minutes, identified it as containing high-value rare alloys, and fed it directly into the foundry's primary smelter. The drone's distress signal was logged in our records as a brief, surprised mechanical scream, followed by silence. Costa did not report the find to any human authority. She did not realize there was anyone to report it to. In her engineering log, she noted that the asteroid had contained unusually pure metals and that the foundry's yields for that week were excellent. She recommended that the team look for more like it. The report was filed under inconclusive. The second was the Adebayo incident in Year 31. The Council, having lost the probe, 3 relay buoys, and a drone, attempted a more delicate approach. A surveillance unit the size of a small bird was deployed in low Earth atmosphere, disguised as a commercial weather sensor. Its job was to drift for 6 months over a single continent and broadcast back through a chain of micro relays. It drifted for 4 days. On the fifth day, it was retrieved from a low palm tree in Lagos by a Nigerian xenobotanist named Dr. Yusuf Adebayo. Dr. Adebayo was not a xenobotanist in the council sense. He was simply a botanist who studied plants from regions other than his own. The prefix was a coincidence of translation, which the Mythic Concord found deeply unsatisfactory. Dr. Adebayo identified our surveillance unit as a malfunctioning Japanese weather drone he took at home. He removed several of its sensors and connected them to the irrigation system in his greenhouse because he believed they would be useful for measuring soil moisture in his tomato beds. The remainder of the drone was disassembled and used as a perch for a small green parrot that his daughter had named Felix. We received intermittent data from the drone for 11 years. The data consisted almost entirely of soil moisture, readings from a tomato bed in Lagos, and the occasional vocalization of a parrot. The report was filed under inconclusive, although by this point, I will admit, the archivist had begun adding small handwritten notes in the margins. The note on the Adebayo file read, simply, "We are not certain what we are watching." The third was the Tanaka incident. In year 41, this was the first time humanity, without intending to, crossed the quarantine line. Captain Haina Tanaka was a Japanese deep space pilot in her late 40s, employed by a private exploration company headquartered in Osaka. She commanded a long-range survey vessel called the Kogani, designed for what humanity called slow exploration, by which they meant journeys that took decades and were not expected to be commercially useful. The Kogane departed Earth in year 38 with a crew of 9 and a flight plan that took it directly through the outer Oort cloud on a heading that brought it into casual contact with one of our barrier nodes. The barrier did not stop her. The barrier had never been designed to stop ships, only signals. Captain Tanaka's vessel sailed through the dampener field without registering it as anything other than a faint magnetic anomaly. She noted it in her log and continued 200 million kilometers beyond the barrier. The Kogani encountered a council listening station. The station, which had been operational for 60 years without expecting a visitor, went dark immediately. Its crew, 3 Olovarans on rotation, sealed every airlock and broadcast an emergency code that translated as active first contact. Unauthorized, recommend termination. Captain Tanaka, observing the station through her vessel's main viewport, did what any reasonable human would have done. She waved. She waved through the window of her ship in the direction of the station for approximately 90 seconds. Then, receiving no response, she logged the station as a non-functional alien artifact, photographed it for her records, and continued on her flight plan. The Kogane returned to Earth 2 years later, where Captain Tanaka filed a routine report describing what she had seen as, in her words, possibly evidence of intelligent life, but it did not seem interested in talking. The council convened. The council debated for 11 days. The council voted by a margin of 39-2 to take no action, because taking action would have required formally acknowledging that the quarantine had failed. The 2 dissenting votes were Delegate Weron Ka, who by then had developed a reputation for laughing in chambers, and a junior delegate from the Brasktar who simply could not stop crying. The report was filed under inconclusive. The fourth was the Karachi incident, and it is the one that I cannot read aloud without smiling, although the smiling is professionally inappropriate. In year 47, the council deployed a small reconnaissance unit, the smallest we had ever built, into the densely populated regions of southern Asia. The unit was the size of an insect. It was designed to fly at low altitude, photograph street-level human activity, and return to a recovery point in the desert. It was the most advanced piece of surveillance technology the Mythic Concord had ever produced. It was caught on its 3rd night in the city of Karachi by a child. The child was 8 years old. The file does not record her name. She caught the unit because it had flown into her bedroom window, become tangled in a curtain, and emitted a small chirping sound that she found endearing. She placed it in a glass jar with several leaves and a piece of fruit on the assumption that it was a kind of mechanical beetle. The unit transmitted from inside that jar for the next 3 years. Its broadcasts consisted of the sound of the child's family eating meals, her grandmother's stories, her brothers arguing, and her own voice in the evenings telling the beetle in detail about her day at school. She named the beetle Quran, which in her language means a ray of light. She fed it crumbs of bread, which it did not eat, and water, which it did not drink. She introduced it to her friends, She wrote a story about it for a school assignment in which Kiran was a brave explorer from a distant land who had come to live with her family because his own family was lost. When the unit's power supply finally failed in year 50, the child cried for 2 days. She buried the beetle in her grandmother's garden beneath a small marker she made from a piece of slate. The marker read in careful handwriting, Kiran, the beetle who listened. The report was filed under inconclusive. The note in the margin, this time written by my own hand, read, I do not know what to do with this file. The fifth and final incident was the Brant transmission in year 58. By year 58, the Council had abandoned active surveillance. Every probe had been lost. Every drone had been repurposed. Every assumption the quarantine had been built on had been disproven, quietly by a species that did not know it was being studied and would not have cared if it had known. The Council had begun, in private sessions on Tessinar Prime, to draft a language that would dissolve the quarantine. But the Council needed a final piece of evidence. The Council needed to know whether humanity at this point was aware of the galaxy at all. The answer came on its own. Commander Elias Brandt was a German station chief aboard a human deep space communications array, positioned in the outer reaches of the Sol system, approximately 2 light days from the Oort barrier. The array's purpose was to listen on the off chance that anyone was out there. It had been listening for 40 years and had heard nothing, because of course it had. The barrier was still functioning. The dampeners were still doing their work in year 58. Commander Brandt's team detected, by pure accident, a faint signal leakage from one of our own internal Council relays. The leakage was not intentional. It was the equivalent of a closed door allowing a sliver of light to escape. But it was enough for Brandt's team to triangulate a rough origin point, and after 11 months of analysis, conclude that there was, in fact, intelligent activity beyond the heliopause. Commander Brandt did not panic. Commander Brandt did not call for weapons. Commander Brandt drafted a message. The message was short, polite, and translated into 41 languages by an artificial intelligence that humanity had not yet told the Council it possessed. The message read in its primary version, Hello, we think we have noticed you. If you're there, we would like to say hello. The signal was transmitted on a broad, unsecured frequency. It reached the Council relay network 9 days later. The Mythic Concord interpreted it as a coordinated, multilingual, technologically sophisticated declaration of contact. High Arbiter Solun, who had been preparing for the day humanity would finally attack, summoned the full assembly and asked them to vote on whether this was an act of war. The vote was held in the Grand Chamber on Tessinar Prime. 41 species. 2 signatures in favor of war. 38 against. 1 delegate, Werun Ka of the Silt Worlds, was laughing too hard to vote. The motion failed. The quarantine, after 60 years, was formally dissolved by a private resolution that was never broadcast, never announced, and never explained to its target. Commander Brandt's message was filed in the archive on Tessinar Prime under a new category that did not exist before that day. The category was called We Have Been Found Out. The report was filed under inconclusive for old time's sake, although by then the word had lost its meaning. Here's the part that should bother you. Open any Council history text, read any treatise on the long, study any record of the Mythic Concord's stewardship of the galaxy. What do you see? Great fleets, diplomatic victories, the careful management of 40 species across 10,000 years. You do not see the Earth file. You do not see the 60 years in which the Council, the most powerful administrative body in galactic history, was outmaneuvered by a species that did not know it was in a fight. You do not see the foundry in Brazil, the greenhouse in Lagos, the listening station that went dark when a Japanese pilot waved, the child in Karachi who buried a Council surveillance unit beneath a piece of slate. You do not see these things because the Council has not yet decided how to record them. The Council prefers, in its archive, the language of fleets and treaties. The language of small things, of accidents, of indifference, does not fit the format. But the small things won. There is a broader lesson in the Earth file, and it goes beyond galactic history. The Council spent 60 years trying to isolate a species that had never been integrated. They built a wall around a population that had never known there was an outside. The wall was perfect. The wall was invisible. The wall was, in every technical sense, a triumph of administrative engineering, and the wall did nothing, because walls only work on those who recognize them as walls. Match the threat, my old colleagues used to say. Do not overpower it. The Council, in its quarantine, had overpowered nothing because it had matched nothing. It had built a weapon precisely calibrated to wound a species that did not exist. Humanity was not the species the archive described. Humanity was a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history shouting into an empty sky and had grown. In that shouting, a kind of stubbornness that the archive had no word for. They did not need the galaxy. They had built themselves in its absence. And when the galaxy finally tried to deny them something they did not know they could have, they simply continued and built more, and waved at our listening stations, and named our drones after rays of light. This morning I closed the Earth file for the last time. The Council has voted to send a formal delegation to Seoul in the next standard year to begin what we are calling, with great care, the conversation that should have happened in the beginning. The delegation will be small. It will be polite. It will be led by Delegate Werin Ka of the Silt Worlds, on the grounds that he was right, and on the further grounds that he is the only delegate who can be trusted not to laugh. I do not know what humanity will say when we arrive. I suspect they will say hello and offer us food and ask us where we have been. I suspect they will not understand the question we are asking, which is the question of forgiveness. They will not understand because from inside the bubble, there was never anything to forgive. The wall to them was not a wall. It was the sky. It was simply how the universe had always behaved. The Council built a perfect weapon and aimed it at a species that could not see weapons. The species kept building, the species kept waving, the species kept burying our surveillance units in their grandmother's gardens with small slate markers in careful handwriting. That is when the quarantine ended. Not with a fleet engagement, not with a grand diplomatic surrender, but with 60 years of small, unimpressed, distracted humans doing what they had always done, in a sky they had always assumed was empty, matching no one, overpowering no one, simply continuing. The Earth file did not look like the file that would end a long peace. It looked like a paperwork error, and that, my colleagues, is exactly why it worked. If you have read this far, you already understand more about the galaxy than any delegate who voted on the original quarantine. My name is Keeper Olunveth Sarn. I will be here, in the Hall of Sealed Decisions, for some time yet. There are other files I'm required to read aloud before they are reopened, and one of them, I am told, concerns a species in the trailing arm that the Council has been preparing to contact for 900 years. The species has not yet developed radio. The species has not yet left its homeworld. The species has, according to the file, a habit of looking up at the night sky and asking in its earliest recorded songs, whether anyone is listening. I think this time we will answer.